Welcome back to the YouTube channel, where today we're going to be discussing expansion and compression, and why, if you struggle to understand what these two concepts mean and how they apply to movement, it probably doesn't matter for any appreciable outcome from a training perspective. So before we go anywhere with the discussion of what expansion and compression is, there's two people that I need you to follow, or at least understand who these guys are, because these are the two major players that are creating a bit of momentum for these terms, and for good reason. The first is being Bill Hartman. Bill Hartman is who I believe to be one of the GOATs of our industry. He's a founding father of iFast, which is a fantastic sports performance gym in Indianapolis. I was lucky enough to spend a couple weeks there in 2016. But Bill Hartman, along with Mike Robertson, started iFast, and they have really created some pivotal pieces and some pivotal discussion points in our industry over the last approximately 10 years. So the first one is Bill Hartman. The second one is Dr. Pat Davidson. Dr. Pat Davidson is someone that we have had on our channel before. Myself and Will Crozier were lucky enough to spend a couple of days with him in New York, which was an incredible experience. And Pat is a wealth of knowledge. He just recently brought out a book called Rethinking the Big Patterns, which I'd highly recommend checking out if you're looking to get into this topic a little bit deeper. In Dr. Pat Davidson's book, he discusses how, from an evolutionary standpoint, nature and evolution in general likes to repeat successful traits of different organisms and different forms of life. And one of the key traits that is expressed throughout all of the universe is this concept of matter and movement expanding before it compresses. And we see this with the way in which animals move, particularly frontal plane animals like reptiles and snakes. They expand on one side whilst they're compressing on the other side. And this reciprocating expansion and compression allows for that animal to move either along the ground, in the air, or through water. And this expansion and compression is obviously expressed in multiple different systems. In fact, pretty much every single system of the human body. When we think about the rib cage and the lungs, when we inhale, they expand. When we exhale, they compress. When we discuss the heart, through its systolic moment, when we have a compression of the heart and a heartbeat, we get an increase in blood pressure. And then the diastolic moment, we get that expansion point where we actually see a decrease in blood pressure. But again, we have this compression and expansion moment through the heart as a result of the system. When we view things like the pupils, they dilate and they compress, and they expand and compress when, depending on what sort of environment we're in and how stressed we are, and all of those inputs coming into our system. We see the same from a muscle belly. A muscle belly will eccentrically elongate, it will expand before it compresses. And in order to get a good contraction, we actually need to move it from a position of expansion, or an eccentrically oriented position. So now we're starting to see how this expansion and compression is sort of an all-encompassing term, or groupings of terms that allow us to better understand how total systems and the interrelationship of different systems of the body actually come together. And this is where expansion and compression lie. They are simply a model. There are a couple terms through which we can very quickly categorize different strategies of movement, and through which we can better understand and hopefully better communicate. However, this is where I think people are falling down with understanding expansion and compression. George Box, a famous statistician, came up with the quote that all models are wrong, but some are useful. And this, I think, is a fantastic quote that fits well within this expansion and compression model and this idea that is growing momentum throughout the industry currently. There are some fantastic concepts surrounding this model that have fantastic applicability. However, for the most part, if you don't understand this model, it isn't really going to impact your ability to get fantastic training outcomes with yourself or your clients, because ultimately there are a million different models through which we can view human movement and training as a whole. So if you don't specifically understand this one, it is simply just a new model, a new way of thinking that challenges the current paradigm of our industry and really starts to hopefully create an all-encompassing model, but ultimately, at the end of the day, it is still a model. So there are many ways through which we can view human movement at the end of the day. An example of this would be something as simple as the planes of motion. Most coaches and people are aware of like the sagittal plane, which is this forward and back dominant motion or up and down. We have the frontal plane, which is sort of our abduction and adduction moments. And then we have the transverse planes, which are our internal and external rotation moments of movement. And we have exercises that are dominant in all three of these planes, with some a little bit more so in the sagittal plane or a little bit more so in the frontal or transverse plane. However, this sagittal, frontal, and transverse way of thinking around human movement is, in fact, a model in and of itself. And it's not 100% accurate. It is inherently wrong. However, it's still incredibly useful, and it got us to this point in time where we are now in the industry, where we can better understand human movement because of this categorization of movement. And this is what the expansion and compression strategy and its model from Bill Hartman and really pushed forward in our industry from Dr. Pat Davidson is. It's just another way of thinking about human movement, where we've replaced certain terms or certain groupings of terms and used compression and expansion to replace those terms. So an example of how these two models or these two ways of thinking sort of coexist in the same example of movement. Dr. Pat Davidson explains this really well in his book, Rethinking the Big Pattern, so I'd highly recommend getting that. But expansion qualities are where we're taking the limbs, just one example, expansion qualities is where we're taking the limbs away from the midline of the body. So this would be things like flexion, where we're moving the arms and the legs away from midline. We're taking abduction moments and external rotation moments, where we're moving the arm away from the body, away from the midline of the body. That would be analogous to expansive movements. We then would have some form of a compressive movement, which is where we're going to be generating force through. And for good reason, because this is where a majority of our force-producing muscles are actually going to be shortening and producing force. So we're going to see this in our extension moments, where we bring the arm back down towards the body, our adduction moments, where we're bringing the arm or the leg back towards the midline, and our internal rotation moments, where we're actually bringing the arm away from that loaded ER position. We see these same qualities in really functional movements like throwing, jumping, and walking or running in the gait cycle. And again, this is just one example of how the expansion and compression terms and verbiage are actually analogous to models that you probably already understand. So is it going to be imperative to understand how this new model or this new way of thinking can influence human movement? Not really, because you really can just use one of the older models that are a little bit more well known in order to describe and understand how movement is actually occurring in the human system. So finally, let's try and tie this into who our audience generally is, which are strength training, powerlifters, and sort of body compositional changes, people that are trying to either increase muscle or decrease fat over time. The expansion and compression model for these two categories of people don't really apply specifically. From a body compositional standpoint, we know that training is simply a vessel for us to increase lean body mass or increase muscle mass across an X period of time. So we know that for the strategies of increasing muscle, tension is the stimulus that we're trying to apply to the muscles, and tension is really not involved within this expansion and compression model from a human movement perspective. We know the typical bodybuilding movements, and ultimately we can execute these movements with just a good understanding of joint range of motion in general. As long as you know how far the elbow can flex and extend, we can really get some fantastic tension on the bicep itself. So from a body compositional standpoint and building muscle, it doesn't really need to apply in that context. From a strength training perspective, maybe it has a little bit more input, because understanding how we generate force, particularly in the lower body when we press into the ground, how it is an internally rotated dominant movement, understanding that compressive force could be beneficial for you. It also could be beneficial to understand how the rib cage and the mechanics of the rib cage move through our breath cycle, because this is ultimately how we're going to build intra-abdominal pressure. So having an understanding of expansion and compression at the rib cage could be of benefit for you as a lifter. However, outside of these two contexts, I truly don't believe that this expansion and compression verbiage is any better than just using flexion, extension, abduction, adduction, ER, and IR. I think these terms are fantastic. They help us to categorize our movement, and at the end of the day, a lot of the industry actually understands these terms. Not to bash on the expansion and compression model, it's a fantastic way of viewing human movement. It is a little bit more all-encompassing because it takes into consideration some universal rules that go far beyond just the human system, which is always a good idea. But ultimately, it is just a model. There may be some useful parts of the model. However, at the end of the day, if you don't understand it, it's not the end of the world. You can still make fantastic gains, and you can still be a fantastic coach if you struggle to understand expansion and compression. So obviously this is a very short video where we really just scratch the surface of what this model actually means. So I can't stress enough that if you do not know who either Bill Hartman or Pat Davidson are, please follow them. I'll make sure Donnie puts Bill's YouTube channel in the bio down below, and then Pat Davidson's Instagram. As well with the Rethinking the Big Patterns book, because they are fantastic resources and they will challenge the way through which you can view movement and view our system as a whole. And I'd highly recommend checking it out because we literally just scratch the surface of what this model tries to encompass. So if you want to learn more, they are the two best resources that I believe for you to better understand what the fuck is going on with this new model. Happy lifting.